So I just wondered if you all could share some of those help establish school norms. So anybody on the panel or any attendees, if you could just chime in on what that might look like in your school.
I think all our schools are a little different. And a few years ago, I'd spent, by this time I'd spent a lot of time in international schools. And I was fortunate enough to get a grant to attend a DataWise conference in Harvard. And it was teaching school leaders, school administrators how to use data. And there were a great number of participants from US schools. And it was in the era of No Child Left Behind. And we came in as a dynamic international school into this group of US educators. And one of the questions in the tutorial that I was in, we had to go around and introduce ourselves and talk about the context of our schools. And then we had to label a hero. And I'm thinking as we're going along, an international mindset about, you know, Nelson Mandela or some of these global figures about change. But what was really humbling for me was listening to the US educators talking about some of the context of their schools and the pressure they're under by their bureaucracies. And again, this is No Child Left Behind sort of era, that some of the social issues that were going on, some of the impacts on kids, free and reduced lunch, all of those things. And then they were still required by the bureaucracy to pull out these numbers. It was humbling to me. And I changed my whole idea about what a hero was. And for me, my hero was anybody who's an administrator in some of these schools, because they are dealing with impacts and limits to educational success that we just do not understand in an international context. Be it the local school in Australia, in the States, the social demographics of that. So I think as leaders, we owe it to our teachers and we owe it to our kids to say, can we possibly get rid of the unnecessary bureaucracies? And yes, we're all about accountability, but are we in control of our own bureaucracies, and how do we free up the culture and the climate for teachers to do the best they can without some sort of imposed bureaucracy or policy that shifts every 3 years on people who are trying to do an enormous amount of good in the world? And how can we possibly change parents' ideas? Nobody complains about their doctor or their lawyer or the engineer that built the bridge, but everybody's had a kid, so they all feel that they can contribute to this conversation. But how do we possibly set the climate through the control of bureaucracy that allows our teachers to be the very, very best that they can? And luckily in international schools, we're not as vetted, but we're dynamic. So we often impose our own bureaucracies on teachers. And it's really important for us as leaders to say, can I just clear the decks? Can these people just do the best they can? And it goes back to my idea of, we're not responsible for results, we're responsible for the people who are responsible for the results. So what can we do to make that climate as good as possible?
Well, I was just thinking if Don Gately wanted to chime in, just because our experience in particularly the New York State, the bureaucracy here is impressive. You know, the amount of data that is collected and required, and that we submit monthly, daily, annually, it's unbelievable. I can't tell you how much. But Don, I didn't know if you wanted to chime in and just share your experiences.
Ned, I was going to say it was. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me, Ned?
Yeah.
And thanks for having me. I'm a middle school principal on Long Island in New York. It was refreshing to hear what Paul said, because I think that Ned and I and many U.S. educators, we're like the frog in the boiling pot of water. I think we've forgotten. Until I heard Paul articulate it, I almost forgot the pressure cooker that we live in. And to some extent, I'm sorry, Ned, I think we've started to accept it. We really have. I don't know how else to say it until I heard Paul just, elucidate it, but, being a public educator in the US, you really do operate under those conditions. And maybe that's a good thing. I think we found ways to, work on our own cultures and, succeed within that framework. We've forgotten to complain about it. I don't know. What do you think, Ned?
Well, again, I always think it's interesting that schools are ranked, by region. So you could have students, and it's all based on our state testing program. So for the most part, whether it's a 3-year average or 5-year average or what have you, newspaper and medias rank school districts and then publish it, and it becomes quite pressure. Our Board of Education is something that I report out to our Board of Education, which is 7 members of our community who are the guiding panel and, determine policies and those things in the US. I report that out to them. And again, in many ways, they hold me accountable to that. So there is pressure, but I also think it's about making sure that we do the right things for students, irrelevant of whether or not those data pieces come together or support your program. Because again, Paul, you said it well, we're responsible for the people who are responsible for those results.
I just want to talk a little bit about the situation, the bureaucracy in Croatia, since I think I'm the only person here who's recently worked in a Croatian state school. And when it comes to bureaucracy, things were horrible and they got worse recently. My wife works in a state high school. It's one of the best, and the amount of work that she has to do regarding bureaucracy, the amount of paperwork she has to fill out, it's insane. I really don't know if I could do her job because apart from planning classes, going to the other side of the city, she has to come home and then go to a ton of websites where she has to do some further education. And then there is an unlimited amount of paperwork to fill out about each student, why they miss class, how they miss class. And then there is always a problem with somebody from the team who is not satisfied with how that paperwork was filled out, because we have those kind of people here as well in our teams, which is a big problem. The paperwork is a stress in itself, and then you have somebody who is very particular about the paperwork. I mean, somebody mentioned that Croatia changed from being a different country, being Yugoslavia, but unfortunately changed all the worst ways. And when it comes to bureaucracy, we stayed the same or got even worse. So, I wish you guys could have one day in a Croatian state school just to see how bad things can get when it comes to bureaucracy.